Sir Gawain and the Green Knights are a topic of discussion today, or today's lecture. And with that, we are moving into the later medieval period. Last time we looked at Beowulf, the great Anglo-Saxon epic, and featured characters that we'd probably say are recognizable as something like heroes, warriors, certainly. It's a warrior culture. That's obvious. There's also a court of sorts. Remember the building, the Herot, which is this magnificent hall in which songs are sung of heroic deeds and legends, and these are celebrated, and virtue is honored in that. And the great hero of Beowulf, who is a mysterious figure, as I said in the lecture, in the book of monsters, Beowulf is actually mentioned as one of the monsters, alongside Grendel, Grendel's mother, and the dragon. So the 140, and Beowulf is one of them. The word Beowulf suggests a bear. So there's something that is almost superhuman about him. So that aspect of it, and there's something of the magical and the supernatural in it. The beasts themselves, the fact that Beowulf can swim for, down to the bottom of the ocean and not, drown of lack of breath and so forth. This is sort of extraordinary stuff. Sir Gawain is a very different thing. It is still the Middle Ages, but it's in the later Middle Ages, so it's the late 14th century, most scholars think. And it's not written in Anglo-Saxon anymore. It's written in Middle English. And Middle English is very different than Anglo-Saxon because of one event, really, and that's the Norman invasion of England in 1066. And with it, he brought, in 1066, the French court and its manners were brought to England. And the influence of the Latin language on English is largely due to this period. So what we get in England, although these days England is presented as a sort of a culture unto itself, it's very much of a multicultural society in the sense that it has so many different people groups that are a part of its heritage. And that continues as time progresses and England becomes eventually an empire, and then people take on English citizenship from various other countries. So it's very much of a multicultural identity, but it's even rooted in the language. What we'll find when we come to Middle English is that many of the words are they lean on the Anglo-Saxon roots. So to this day, I'd say the foundation of English is Anglo-Saxon, but many of the words are Latin. But the more earthy ones, the more poetic ones tend to be Anglo-Saxon. And the more sophisticated ones and the more difficult ones, at least for English speakers to understand, are the Latin ones. They're easier if you're coming from another European country because there's a common inheritance of Latin. So French and Spanish and Italian, Portuguese, Romanian, and so forth, these are direct inheritance from Latin, so there's a far greater predominance of Latin words in those languages. So when they find a Latin word in English, they say, oh, I know what that word is, and vice versa. So in English, you can pick up Latin words from other countries when you do that. But this is written as a chivalric romance, and the court has changed quite significantly. And it's changed because, unlike Beowulf, which was written by a Christian poet in a pagan setting, now we have a Christian poet writing a Christian story. And what has changed is the court itself. Now I put on the board here 3 words that have come up over the course of our studies, and I wanted to emphasize something here. And that's the importance of not only the heroes. We've had heroes throughout our stories. We started with Odysseus, and then we moved to Aeneas, and then on to Dante himself as a hero of sorts, going on a quest. We had Beowulf. These are all heroic figures, but they all had something connected to them that was important. And the thing that was important is the moral virtue that they represented. But the moral virtue is sometimes a little bit more, sometimes more obvious, sometimes less obvious. And but I'll do it by connecting it to words that have been used in the context of these epics. The Greek word polis is just the city, state. From the word polis, we get our sense of politics, but also our sense of to be polite. To be polite is the conduct appropriate to the polis. We use that word to this day in English. You can also use the word politic. To be politic is to be conscious of the effect of your words and to want to create a consensus or an agreement amongst the people you're speaking to. That's being politic. We also speak of being politically correct. That's in the same direction, except there's a suggestion of an orthodoxy there, which there isn't quite in the word being polite. Political correctness is adherence to a dogma of some sort, whereas to be polite is simply to recognize the sensitivities of others, but without imposing a norm. But that word polite, and we saw it with Odysseus, this is again the Greek word, insofar as the emphasis was placed on hospitality and so forth, and offering gifts and so forth. Remember, Odysseus expected to be given a gift, and likewise, even Polyphemus, what gift are you going to give me? That's part of hospitality, and part of being polite is acknowledging the person that you're speaking to and treating them appropriately. But politeness is important. When we move to the Roman period, this word civitas is the same thing, more or less, in Augustine's what's the De Civitate Dei, the city of God? It's again the city. And from this we get civility. There's a Canadian organization actually called Civitas, of which I'm a member. It's the foundations of a civil society. What constitutes that? How do we act in a way which is going to be for the common good? What is the common good? How does one pursue the common good? In Virgil's Aeneid, he founded a city which eventually became Rome. It was the foundation of the Roman Empire, the eternal city. Right? But the emphasis in Aeneas was on his piety. That was the civility that the foundational virtue that Aeneas had was his piety. He respected his ancestors, but he also lived for the future. Remember, he was willing to defer his own self-gratification for the sake of the city that did not yet exist. He left Troy, I talked about this going down into the underworld. He entered the underworld as a Trojan. He left as a Roman, having heard what Rome would become. But that feature of his character, the civility, was his piety. And that was a Roman virtue. And they expected piety of one another, which means a faithfulness to Rome and its people and its endurance. He represented that. And then finally, the court, from which we get the word courtesy. All these are now English words, and they lean on these earlier words. And yet they still exist. What's the difference between polite, being civil, and being courteous? Can you tell me the difference? I don't think there is a difference. There are three different words referring to a similar sort of thing, and yet they have three different origins. One's Greek, one's Latin, and the other is medieval. Now, the court was obviously there to some degree in Beowulf even. There was a king, and those who surrounded the king were courtiers, and they practiced courtesy. And this was very important in every context. It was the essence of what they represented and what they were also fighting for. There was a threat of some sort. What were they defending? it wasn't only their self-interest, it was a way of life. It was a sense of the public good that they were going to seek to hold on to. And that was that's been in all of the things that we've looked at here. Now I've put on the top of my little outline there a quotation, a medieval quotation. It's translated as "manners maketh man." I can't remember what the Latin phrase is exactly, but I think it's an English school proverb. And it suggests a different sense of what's going on here. When we're talking about the city here, and remember when I went, and even when we looked at Plato's Republic, it's actually Plato's Polis. That's what it's called in the original. Hey, Polis. It's not the Republic. That's a Latin translation of the original. It's a certain type of city. And note they don't just translate it as the city, they translate it as the Republic, because there's a certain type of city that's being depicted there, and it's a republic. It's not an empire, for instance, because in the time in which they're translating the Greek into the Latin, there are two factions at work there. One are the Republicans that are trying to prevent the empire from happening, and the bad effects of an imperial regime, where it's all the powers in the Caesar, in the emperor. So it's translated, interestingly, as the Republican, but what's being represented is a certain view of the city, and also a certain view of humanity. And this is where I want to begin this discussion here, is when you're studying here at Tyndale, you're studying the humanities, basically. We don't offer many of the sciences here. I think we're hoping to do so more in the future. But this is a humanities-based institution. Even when you study theology, theology is a sort of humanities. It's because Jesus took on human nature. It's not just a theological statement, it's a statement about what a human being is, what a good human being is. What does it look like to be a human being living a full life and the way that it's supposed to be? Well, we look to Jesus. That's a theological statement, but it's even an anthropological statement. How ought we to live as people? And so there are two senses of humanity here, which I want to flesh out. On the one hand, humanity refers to those creatures that walk on two legs and use reason, and they're naked, and they're without, right? Animals have fur or feathers or whatever. They all have some sort of covering. We don't have a covering. So the naked ape, some call it. That sense of humanity, is there a distinction there between mankind and the other creatures? I think yes. But that's the biological distinction. That's not what I'm talking about here, and that's not what they're talking about here. They're talking about the moral dimension. What is it that constitutes human nature, looking at it from a moral vantage point? And I already said when we looked at the compared Genesis to Ovid, that was one of the things that really jumped out, was that God called things good. It mattered to God that it was a goodness there. It was part of God's character to call things good and not good and so forth. So there's a moral judgment there. And also mankind made in his image has a moral nature. Right? We talked about that as well. And so then the question is to become, you're already human by virtue of simply your biological inheritance. But how do you become a true human? Well, through your conduct, through your moral conduct, through your judgment, through the way you treat others. That's an aspect of humanitas. So this word humanitas in Latin does refer to mankind as opposed to the gods, or as opposed to the animal. It does have that. So that's the first meaning. But the second meaning is more important. It's the very thing that makes humanity worthy of the name of that distinct creature. To be humane. We have the Humane Society now. It's how to treat animals in a way that's befitting human nature. Right? And recognizing the difference between animals and people. You treat them humanely. Right? I'm just using words that we use in our own language, and we have certain senses. That's not the way to do things. Well, why not? I say that because in some cultures, anything that walks and isn't a person is food. If you're Chinese, If it walks around, even if it's a dog, a cat, a horse, that's food, right? That's it. That's not the understanding that's established in the Western world. This is a creature, and there are domestic animals, and there are wild animals. You can eat the wild animals, you can't eat the domestic animals, basically. Or there are certain types of domestic animals that you can eat, and others you can't. So you don't eat dogs, and you don't eat cats, and you don't eat horses, at least in the English-speaking world. These are things that you don't do. It's not because they don't taste good. I have no idea. I haven't tried them myself. But it's not the taste that makes the distinction. It's because these domesticated animals, dogs, cats, horses, are seen part of an extension of human nature. They're part of our household. They're part of our family, as it were. It's not that they're human, although we may talk to them and like they're human, and we may treat them better than we do people sometimes. But still, there's that sense, there's a difference there. Well, that's our understanding of the city and the consequences of civilization, is that we treat things differently. All that said here, do you get the point here? I'll give you another illustration. And this is not related to what we've said thus far. But when I was in Durham studying in the 90s, I met a man who worked for Billy Graham for many years. I won't mention his name for no particular reason, but he was a really good man. And he was the most polite man I ever met. He was extraordinary in his decorum, in his dress, in his speech, in everything about him. He was the most agreeable man I've ever met. And that was appropriate because what he did for Billy Graham is he would go as the sort of, I wouldn't say the spies, but he was sent as the advanced party into countries before Billy Graham was going to come and give one of his, big tent speeches and so forth. And he would go, and what he was trying to find out is what are the sensibilities of the local culture, and how can we avoid unnecessarily offending. In some countries, you offer people your right hand in greeting. In other countries, you don't do that. In some countries, you can wave and it means something. In other countries, you can't do that. There are some gestures that are taken as normal in some countries. In others, this is gravely offensive. Never offer somebody your left hand in the Islamic world. Never. Because you only do one thing with your left hand. And if you don't know what that is, you wipe yourself with your left hand. If you offer your left hand, it's a grave insult, right? You're saying something there. Similarly, if you're angry in the Islamic world, you pick up the shoe, the bottom of your shoe, to show them the sole of your foot. So it's not just picking up your shoe. If you show somebody the bottom of your feet, like put them up on your desk, this is grave offense. You're worthy of being on the bottom of my sole, the sole of my foot. Again, these are culture-specific understandings of what politeness is and not. And you need to know these in order to present, in this case of Billy Graham, present the Christian faith in a way that's not going to cause gratuitous offense. He is aware that the consequences of the Christian message, that Christ died for your sins, you need to repent, is offensive to many. He doesn't want to add to the offensiveness. So being courteous, being polite, being civil is vital. And it remains vital, I would say, to all Christians to this day. And not just all Christians, I would say all people. This is a great virtue. And the humanities are to cultivate that. And I think that we try to do that here. At least I try. So it's not just about insignificant things. It's really of the essence of what makes us most human when we consider such matters. Now, I say that because when we come to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, there is a particularly courteous culture. It's a high point in some ways of Christian culture, or at least not that it's the most Christian, but it's the most conspicuously Christian in almost every respect. This is the time of King Arthur and his knights, the Knights of the Round Table. Some have questioned whether there ever were such figures or whether they were legends. The reason why that is the case is because the stories of King Arthur and his knights really begin in France, not in England. The stories about King Arthur and his court are in Normandy and so forth, or in the south of France. And there's a tradition of celebrating King Arthur and his knights, not in England but here. So is this just a legend and not a true story? Well, recent archaeology has unearthed things in Wales, that a certain area to the west of England, that suggests that there was a King Arthur and a Camelot. And it's a period that's represented, that is represented in popular culture and so forth. I don't know if you've seen King Arthur movies. But when we were reading Dante, he was leaning on this as well. Lancelot and Guinevere. Guinevere's King Arthur's queen. Lancelot is his first knight. They have an adulterous affair. It destroys the kingdom. But it follows the courtly love tradition. This was written in around the same time. So around the same time that Dante is writing his work, probably a century later, we get this great poem. And it's one of the best known Arthurian stories. And it surrounds this fellow by the name of Sir Gawain. And Sir Gawain is known for his courtesy. Above all things, he is known as a courteous knight. And that word has a lot of weight here. Just like Virgil's or Aeneas's piety and Odysseus's, what's the word for Odysseus? It's not as cunning, but it's of that sort. His wisdom, as the goddess Athena is the goddess of wisdom, Odysseus is like him, so his wisdom. In the same way, Gawain is a courteous knight, and he is working within in the age of chivalry. So it's surrounding the court, but it's connected with chivalry. And that comes from the word cheval for a horse in French. Chevalier is a knight. Knights ride horses. Horses are a domesticated animal, yes, but there's a certain nobility to the horse. And in some ways it's a reflection of the relation of Christ and culture, that you take an animal that's part of the animal world and it's now brought into the human world such as that people are elevated by it. That's interesting. If you're on a horse, you're actually literally higher above the ground. But it represents a certain virtuous relation of humanity to the natural world and a right relation of some sort. So it's almost symbolized in that. So that's where it began. The translation that we're going to use is by J.R.R. Tolkien, who I mentioned last time when talking about Beowulf, because he almost single-handedly made Beowulf the great epic that it's received as today in the 20th century. But he also translated this, and he translated Pearl and Sir Orfeo that are in here. But that's because he was a medievalist and also the author of The Lord of the Rings, just by the way, if you didn't know, but I suspect most people did know. But he came to translate this, and it's a very odd story, and it's written in the romance genre. So let me just talk about that briefly. Romance genre. I say that because thus far we have not looked at much besides epic, other than a tragedy. We looked at Oedipus the King, Oedipus Rex. That was a tragedy. That's a different type of genre. That's the theater. We'll come to another medieval play as well, Everyman. But we've looked at largely at epics, and with the epics we have traced this sort of thing. This is what we've traced. The translation from the polis to the civitas to the court. And along with it, the great divide lies here, right there. And this becomes transformed in the process because the city of Rome becomes the seat of Christianity, right? And with it, the Holy Roman Empire. So this has transformed the city, and this is a representation of that in Northern Europe, the court around the king, wherever the king is, because the king is then understood in Christian terms as God's vice-regent on earth. So he is the steward. He's been given his power by God, the king, and the king is to exercise his rule in the light of that great bequest. And so kings start to have coronation ceremonies and so forth, and they swear an oath of allegiance to God and to protect their kingdom and so forth. And that's part of the king's courtly duties. And that's certainly the case here, which we'll see in just a second. Any comments or questions at this point? I've given you a big sort of historical overview. I'm just trying to get you to see some of the connections on the course. Because these things, as I say, politeness, civility, courtesy, they remain as important today as ever. They might have changed in certain respects. How does politeness look today? When I grew up, you held the door for people when you went into a room. Like if I came to the door first and there's somebody behind me, I'd open the door and the person behind me walked through. That was called courtesy. That has by and large gone by the by. I still do it myself, but that's because of my age, largely, I suspect. And it's not just because of my age. I actually think it is courteous. What does it represent? It represents putting somebody else's needs ahead of yours. That's it. I want to go through the door too. I'm there first. Why wouldn't I go through the door first? Why not? I mean, I was there first. I'm opening the door because it's a small nod to putting others ahead of yourself. That's it. Nothing else. Yeah.
I noticed myself on the highway, it's just cutting in front of people often and not.
As do I, because it's the way of Toronto.
But when someone pulls in front of me and they'll give a little wave or whatever,
yeah,
it adds a little something. So I started to.
A little hot sauce.
No, it's a.
Oh, you like it?
Courtesy. Yeah.
Okay.
Fine. I mean, they could still do it in a ruthless way, but even the little hand and be like, "Hey, I know I'm being ruthless, but." I don't know. It seems to. So.
Yes.
That seems like a courtesy.
It's an acknowledgement, at least, of something.
Yeah.
Right.
And when I serve at a restaurant, and I certainly notice when the children, especially, are mannerly and they're like, please and thank you, man, it just really
makes all it. It's an acknowledgement of the humanity of the other person. Even if the other person is serving you, there's a recognition of that is not a status. It's you are being served, and you're recognizing that service is something that we are all called to do, and I am not looking down on you even though you're serving me. There's just this, that's it, right? Well, that's a Christian understanding. Implicit. I'm not saying it's explicit, but it's implicit. It's in the culture. Yes.
And the other thing I just wanted to ask about was, do we see a progression of that from the Odyssey up until this point? Because
yes.
Was it in the Odyssey? I know hospitality was huge.
Hospitality is huge, and it remains huge throughout much of the world.
But they also valued deceit, like you said, and that was their wisdom.
Yeah. It was viewed as wise conduct in terms of it was used for the purposes of discernment, but also concealment, right? You're concealing your identity from your enemies, but also it's a way of figuring out is the person as they appear to be, because they might be in disguise,
So
right?
That in their view didn't detract from
No, it didn't. No. And so in the Odyssey, deceit is regularly practiced as wise conduct. Come the Christian era, there are going to be great questions about this. How is this not fraudulent? And you'll find that in many renderings, Odysseus, including, by the way, in Dante, Ulysses is down in the underworld, in hell, because he's a fraud and he's a betrayer. He uses the Trojan horse to invade a city. So he's judged by Dante to be in hell. So he's the opposite of the hero. That worked back in the era where they didn't know Christ. But we judge differently now. He's not our hero. And I don't think he's our hero either, by the way. I'm not suggesting that Ulysses is the hero any more than I would say that Achilles is. He's not my hero. But he is a certain type of hero. And to see the progression of heroism, and also just to see how different we look at things, it's really helpful to have a contrast. I put this up, it's a comment by C.S. Lewis. When we're trying to live today and think about today, we can't look to the future. We don't know what it's going to be like tomorrow. The only way we can compare and contrast and look at and really think about ourselves is by looking at how are things different in another culture, or how are things different even in our own culture historically. And then we can say, you know, the contemporary way of looking at things is really silly. Or actually what we call politeness is not particularly polite, like political correctness. Where's the politeness? So if somebody says something that offends you, you shout them down, you deplatform them, right? They should never be allowed to speak in public again. How is that polite? Somebody says something that offends you, and it's an irrecoverable, irredeemable sin against the body politic. So somebody has got to be drummed out of the public life, not allowed to speak again. How does that fit with politeness? That doesn't appear so obvious unless you compare. So that's one of the reasons we're doing this, is to show that. Get you to think about the way you think of things habitually may not be the right way. I'm not saying it's the wrong way either. I'm just saying let's stand back, look at it with a little bit of different eyes, and then come and say, okay, how am I going to act going forward, and think about that. And it's really helpful in Canada, where there are so many cultures now. You know, is there a different way of looking at this? Well, yes, there is. And then the bigger question, and the most important one, what's the right way to do it? Not just these are all different, as if that was legitimate just because it's different. In the 19th century, and I can't remember the name of the British vice-regent in India, but there was a practice of burning widows in India. So a man died, and the widow, they would burn the widow along with it. And the British found this to be morally repugnant. So this is awful. Like, why this is not going to happen? And they were told that's what we do in our culture. So, you know, keep your opinions to yourself. And the man whose name escapes me said, well, in my culture, we hang people who do that. That's my culture. So go ahead and do that, but in my culture we hang people, and you're under the rule of the British Crown here. Go ahead and practice your cultural practice, and then I'll practice my cultural practice. I'm not saying yours is right and mine's wrong, but here's what we're going to do. What's the difference between them? Which one's right? They're both cultural practices. It comes down to, what is human nature? What's the right view of human nature? Which is the one that expresses our humanity? That's what I'm trying to get you to think about on this course. This is a course in literature, but it's also a course in the humanities, and it's to get you to think about humanities. Well, why would we not burn widows? I don't know why we would, to be honest. But why would we not do that? Well, it's because this is a human being and has value, has worth. Why? Because I would say that because a woman bears the imago Dei, and therefore we can't do that. We ought not to do it. It's wrong to do that. That's what the British vice-regent thought. If I said that in the university in the 1980s, even in Canada, the response would be, well, I agree, but we mustn't judge. I'm telling you, that was the common response. We ought not to impose our values on others. In other words, cultural relativism. I am not fostering cultural relativism in this course. That's not the point of the different eras. It's the question, what is the right view of humanity? And to get us to think that the way we look at it might not be the right way of looking at it. Because we come with the cultural baggage of being in Canada in 2019. And the way Canadians look at it, they think that they are the soul of civility and politeness and inclusiveness and all of that. Is it correct? Is the view correct? That's what we're looking at here. Did you have a question or comment? Go, please.
In this time period with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight,
yes.
Was Christianity more influential here, or was it like the same in Dante's era?
Around the same, but it's very different. It's both and. It's still the courtly love tradition. So I remember we said that Dante was a courtly love poet, and that there were certain conventions there. The woman was put on a pedestal, as it were. The man who was her social inferior would to some degree worship her, talk about how she looked like a goddess or an angel, and there were descriptions that were fitting. You know, her hair looks like this, and her eyes shine like stars, and her lips are like rubies, and etc., etc. It's all part of the courtly love tradition, and part of what we call romantic love to this day. That comes from this tradition, where women are worshipped to some degree by men. That's part of the courtly love tradition. The whole idea of romantic love comes out of this romance genre. It's not there in every country. It really is not. It's a Western cultural inheritance, which we say is correct. Are we correct in thinking that it's correct? We might not be. I happen to value it, and I can give a reason for it, but I'm just saying we can notice that, guess what? The courtly love tradition of wooing a woman and regarding her as your superior in some ways, and would you do me the honor, and so forth. We don't find that in Rome, and we don't find that in ancient Greece. It's just not there. The relationship between men and women, it changes over the course of time. The relationships between adults and children change here. In the ancient world, in Rome, a father can disinherit his children, and he can do anything with his children up until the age he adopts them. So it's my natural son. I have a son. I have a daughter, but they're not in Roman. If I were in Rome, ancient Rome, they would not be my children until I officially adopted them as my heirs. Before that time, I could have them executed, and the state would not stand in my way. It was my authority. It was in my house. They're my property, more or less, including my wife likewise. I can dispense with her. Right? Christianity changes all that. They start adopting kids that have been left to die outside. They're rescuing children that aren't even their own. They're bringing them in their own house and adopting them as their own children, giving them a legitimacy. Why? Because these people bear the imago Dei, little babies, someone else's baby. I'm going to adopt that child. It's a very different way of looking at it. So the view of women changes because of Christianity, the view of children, and the view of foreigners. All of these things are transformed in this period. And now we've come to the Christian era, and we have something like a golden age, I would put it to you as well. I talked about this even in relation to Virgil's Aeneid. He talked about bringing about a golden age. That's what the epic is about. Right? Augustus Caesar, he brings in the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome, which is by military might. There will be no more wars. Well, why? Because you don't dare try otherwise. The Roman army will crush you. And so it's the rule of law with the military might to enforce it. But it's not peace by consent. It's by coercion. Now there's a different sort of peace and a different sort of manners that take place. And it's a very mannerly court, and it surrounds the round table. Now, do you know about the round table? The table's obviously round. I need to explain that. Why a round table? Who cares? Like, you got a round table, you got a rectangular table. What's the difference? There's no head at a round table. There's an equality of sorts. And the king is the first among equals. It's an expression of a Christian understanding of the equal humanity of everyone that surrounds the round table. That's it. And they lay their swords in the middle, and they're all dedicated. The points of the swords are dedicated to this. They're all pointing the same direction towards the middle. And the king is in their midst, and he's the first among equals, for sure. He is the king. And yet there's an understanding that they have a share in the power. He's not an emperor. The king's not an emperor. He doesn't have absolute power. He has limited power, and it's limited by those around him who share in his commitment to a certain types of culture. So that's how this begins. It is a romance. It has a hero. By the way, romance, the genre I said about the romance. A romance involves a hero. So in that sense, it's like the epic. He goes on a quest. In that sense, it's not like an epic. Epics don't have quests per se, although they have some features of that, but it's not really about a quest. They don't go to do a certain thing. And it is, whereas an epic seems to be talking about everything, and so it's encyclopedic, a romance is episodic. It tells a little story within the context of the whole of King Arthur and his Green Knights. And there are a lot of different stories. This is just one story. So it's just a little episode. So that's where a romance differs from an epic. An epic has the supernatural in it. Well, so does the romance. So those are common features. It has a hero. It involves the supernatural. Those things are common. Where it differs is that in the romance there's a quest. You're doing a particular thing. And also it's just an episode. It's not telling the whole story of humanity from beginning to end. So it's a lesser claim, a more minor type of genre. Why don't we come to the, as I say, it's written in Middle English, probably in the late 14th century, although you can read Tolkien's introduction here. But let's read, I'm going to read you the first few lines here of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. And it's really interesting in the light of what I've just said about Rome and Troy, because the author, and by the way, we have no idea who the author is, just like Beowulf. It's an unknown author. But immediately he cites some of the stories that we were already acquainted with. So when the siege and the assault had ceased at Troy, and the fortress fell in flame to firebrands and ashes, the traitor who the contrivance of treason there fashioned was tried for his treachery, the most true upon earth. It was Aeneas the noble and his renowned kindred who then laid under them lands, and lords became of well-nigh all the wealth in the western isles. When great Romulus to Rome his road had taken, in great pomp and pride he peopled it first, and named it with his own name, that yet now it bears. Tyrius went to Tuscany, and towns founded. Langobard in Lombardy uplifted halls, and far over the French flood, Felix Brutus on many a broad bank and brae, Britain established full fair, where strange things, strife and sadness, at whiles in the land did fare, and each other grief and sadness off fast have followed there. So this is the first fit here. So there are 4 fits, by the way, 4 divisions within this romance. So this is fit 1, F-I-T-T. And there are 4 little chapters, if you will. It begins with these lines, and then it moves to the next thing. Now you will see even on your page, the lineation is different. In the last 4 lines there are 5. So it becomes metrical. That little indented portion is called a bob and wheel. Put it down here. Bob. And it's obviously, it stands out as a feature of the writing. The other thing that stands out is the alliteration. Even in the translation, Tolkien's translation, you could hear the repeated alliteration. Every line has at least 3 of the same sounds, sometimes 4. But it's heavily alliterative, and it uses the bob and wheel, and I'll talk about the bob and wheel in a second, but you wanted to ask a question.
Just on the bob and wheel, is that like for the one word at the end of a paragraph?
Yes.
Put to the right?
Yeah, that's the bob, and then the wheel is what follows it. Yeah. And what that does is it concludes that little portion of the narrative, and then it moves on to the next. In English, when you write an essay or when you write a story, you finish a thought with a paragraph, with a pause, like with a space. This finishes it a little differently, far more poetically. So when he finishes a little narrative episode, he concludes it with the bob and wheel, and then it moves on to the next. But that's the feature of it here. the bob and wheel. And as it said, what did we encounter in this first little narrative episode here? Harkening back to Troy, to the Trojan War. Common feature of the Greek epic, the Roman epic, and now this story. Troy is a really important event. Like, whatever you make of it, some people have doubted whether Troy exists. Now nobody does. But historically, in the 18th and 19th century, some thought that Troy may be a legend, just like King Arthur and his knights, which now, again, most people regard as, yes, there was a King Arthur. Troy is more important in the poetic imagination than it is as a physical city. It really has such deep importance. And it's referenced here. So when the siege and the assault had ceased at Troy, and the fortress fell in flame, that's the account in the Aeneid, to firebrands and ashes, the traitor, who the contrivance of treason there fashion was tried for his treachery. The most true upon earth. Well, who's the traitor who contrived treason? I would have thought it was Odysseus. But it doesn't say. There are a variety there. But the most true upon earth, it was Aeneas the noble and his renowned kindred, who then laid under them lands, and lords became of well nigh all the wealth in the Western Isles. The Roman Empire. So he's just told the story in those 5 or 6 lines. And then when royal Romulus to Rome his road had taken, that's a different rendering. Remus and Romulus, 2 brothers who were orphans, and they suckled under a she-wolf. Is that a myth? I suspect so. And then what does Romulus do? He slays his brother Remus. It's like a Cain and Abel story. And it says something about the Roman Empire. It's been forged and founded upon blood. It's not good. It's a legendary story, but there's a quarrel between 2 brothers. And one slays the other and founds that empire, and then he moves from Rome to Tuscany, which is in Italy, where Dante was. Tuscany is right in the middle of Florence is in Tuscany. Then he goes to Lombardy, which is in France, and then finally to Britain, where Felix Brutus comes. Felix the Blessed, or the Blessed Brutus, or the Happy Brutus, Felix. He goes and founds Britain. So he's connecting now Britain to France, to Italy, to Rome, to Greece. All of those in one episode. So he's talking about heroic, and although this is a romance, not an epic, he's making epic claims of the greatness of the court. It's not written as an epic, but there is a sort of an epic comparison being made by virtue of the analogies he draws there, or the lineage he does. And he says, in Britain they established full fare, where strange things, strife and sadness, at whiles in the land did fare, and each other grief and gladness oft fast have followed there. So it began in mourning, and it gave way to a time of blessedness. And when fair Britain, it goes on, was founded by this famous lord, bold men were bred there, who in battle rejoiced. And many a time that betid they troubles aroused, in this domain more marvels have by men been seen than in any other that I know of since that olden time. But of all that here abode in Britain as kings, ever was Arthur most honored, as I've heard men tell, whereof a marvel among men I mean to recall. A strange sight to see some men have held it. One of the wildest adventures of the wonders of Arthur. If you will listen to this lay but a little while now, I will tell it once as in town I have heard it told, as it is fixed and fettered in story brave and bold, thus linked and truly lettered, as was loved in this land of old. So that's his intro. Doesn't appeal to amuse. Note, no invocation of amuse. He doesn't need a higher power to tell the story. This is an old story. I've heard it told. I'm going to tell you the story myself. So he's recalling a deeds done in the past. It's a tale. It's a tale of significance. But it's a wild story, and it's of Arthur and his knights at Camelot. So I talked about the round table. There's an expression there of human unity, united around the table. By the way, when the kingdom breaks apart, the table breaks with it, and the unity. There's the fragmentation; it all breaks apart. But there's something of a golden age there, and it's all surrounded around the court. But also, the court is in the city, and the city is called Camelot. And in the kingdom is called Logres, by the way. But Camelot's the city. And if you don't think that these sorts of appeals matters, in the 1960s in the U.S., John F. Kennedy and he was a young Democrat president, and his group, they spoke of them as Camelot. It's a sort of a reference to a golden age. It's post-World War II. We have a young, dashing president. Whatever you make of, I'm not talking about the politics. I'm talking about the type of language that was used. They were talked of as it's Camelot. This is an age then of civil society, of politeness. Before Vietnam, before all of that stuff, that was a sort of a golden time, and then it breaks all apart. Powerful and potent stuff. Anyway. He's going to tell the story of Arthur. So Arthur, who is the king within Camelot. And it happens when? At Christmas tide. I'll read the third segment here. This king lay at Camelot at Christmas tide with many a lovely lord, lieges most noble, indeed of the table round all those tried brethren, amid merriment unmatched and mirth without care. There tourneyed many a time with the trusty knights, and jousted full joyously these gentle lords. Then to the court they came at carols to play. They're singing Christmas carols. For there the feast was unfailing full 15 days, with all meats and all mirth that men could devise, such gladness and gaiety as was glorious to hear, din of voices by day and dancing by night. All happiness at the highest in halls and in bowers had the lords and the ladies, such as they loved most dearly. With all the bliss of this world they abode together, the knights most renowned after the name of Christ, and the ladies most lovely that ever life enjoyed. And he, king most courteous, who that court possessed. For all that folk so fair did in their first estate abide, under heaven the first in fame, their king most high in pride. It would now be hard to name a troop in war so tried. So that's how it begins. It begins with really a portrait of humanity at its zenith. It's the most famous of all courts, more famous than any of the ones that were previously mentioned, than Troy, than Rome, any of those. That's the high claim being made for the king. But there's already a hint of concern here, because remember, this is a Christian poet. And what does he say about King Arthur? That he is most high in pride. That's an ominous tone, because before pride cometh a fall. Right? There's some arrogance here. There's a little bit of self-importance. It's in the midst of a Christian context, a Christian culture, and yet what is the inner character of the knight? Now it's and of the king, because it's expected in a Christian court with courtesy operative that you will put others ahead of yourself. That humility will be a feature of the king and his knights. Is it a feature of King Arthur and his court? That's one of the things the story is going to reveal. Let me read the fourth segment here. So it's Christmas time. It's this Christmas is a Christian holiday, obviously, but it's the time when the great miracle of all miracles takes place. God takes on human flesh, born in the form of a baby. Is the miracle, right? Easter is the most significant in the Christian calendar for its theological significance, but the incarnation at Christmas is the great miracle, and it's a time of of wonder. So you talk about the supernatural in the Odyssey and in the Aeneid and so forth. There's a sense of the supernatural, but it's a story, and it's not how real is this. Here it's presented as a real event with supernatural significance. Anyway, it's still in the middle of the 12 days of Christmas. And while New Year was yet young, so it's still within Christmastide, that yester eve had arrived. That day, double dainties on the dais were served. Oh, so extra dessert. Great. When the king was there, come with his courtiers to the hall, and the chanting of the choir in the chapel had ended with loud clamor and cries. Both clerks and laymen, Noel announced anew, and named it full often. When nobles ran anon with New Year gifts, hansels, hansels, they shouted and handed them out, competed for those presents in playful debate. Ladies laughed loudly, though they lost the game. And he that won was not woeful, as may well be believed, because he acted, oh, I've won. How does one comport oneself in victory? Do you triumph? Do you what you see in sports now? When somebody scores a goal and they're like this, and the crowd, shouting at the crowd, they're, the sort of, like, is that what you do when you score, when you victory? Are you going up to the crowd that's not what happens here. They score a goal, they do whatever, they win and how do you act? You act as if you had lost the game. Why? They're wary of pride. They're aware the victory didn't come from them. He said, so the ladies laugh loudly, though they lost the game. So they act opposite to the way their natural inclination would be. Not because they didn't want to win. They did want to win, but here's how you're supposed to behave in victory and in loss. You act as if you've lost the game when you win, and he that won was not woeful, as may well be believed. All this merriment was made, and everybody's happy, because there's a recognition of human sinfulness and the need for humility. That marks the court. All this merriment was made till their meat was served, then they washed, and mannerly went to their seats. So they don't clamor and say, I'm going to get here and push people away and get to the seat. They go mannerly. There's a politeness. People sit where they're supposed to. They wash themselves. Ever the highest for the worthiest, as was held to be best. Queen Guinevere the gay was with grace in the midst of the adorned dais set. So in the midst of the high place. Dearly it was arrayed. Finest sendal at her sides, a ceiling above her of true tissue of Toulouse. So there's this little, like a little tent, you know what I mean? Like above her, she's in a little, if you ever watch in movies of jousts and so forth, the queen often has a little cover over her head and so forth. That's where she's arrayed, and with tapestries of Tharsia that were embroidered and bound with the brightest gems, one might prove in a praise to the purchase for coin any day. The loveliest lady there, on them glanced with eyes of grey. That he found ever one more fair, in sooth might no man say. There is no one more beautiful than Guinevere. Is she actually more beautiful, or is she just held to be that? I don't know. I think she is. She's that beautiful. And here's where the challenge begins. But Arthur would not eat until all were served. So he's the king. He's not going to eat his food, even though the food's set in front of him. How come? Same thing. He who is first shall be last, and last shall be first. That's it. So he's not going to eat until everybody's been served, even though he's the king. His youth made him so merry with the moods of a boy. He liked light-hearted life, so loved he the less either long to be lying or long to be seated. So worked on him his young blood and wayward brain. And another rule, moreover, was his reason besides, that in pride he had appointed. So these were good reasons. But there's pride, and this is the reason. It pleased him not to eat upon festival so fair, ere he first was apprised of some strange story or stirring adventure. or some moving marvel that he might believe in of noblemen, knighthood, or new adventures. Or a challenger should come, a champion seeking to join with him in jousting, in jeopardy to set his life against life, each allowing the other the favor of fortune, were she fairer to him. This was the knight's custom, wherever his court was holden. At each famous feast, among his fair company in hall, so his face doth proud appear. And he stands up, stout and tall, all young in the new year, much mirth he makes with all. So what do we get here? It's his custom. So here's the way the court acts with courtesy and civility. These things are there. Yet King Arthur has a custom, and it's his custom. It's not his people's custom, it's his own custom. And what's the custom? Whenever it comes to a feast, and feasts, by the way, in the Christian calendar are celebrating miracles. Like it's a saint's day of some sort, or it's in this case, it's Christmas. It's the greatest miracle of all. But he will not eat until he hears a miraculous story. A different miraculous story. Of what? Renown in his own day. It's not enough. He's not satisfied with the miracle of Christmas. He wants another miracle. He wants one he wants a joust in which he can demonstrate the virtue of his own arm. But that's what a joust does, by the way. There's two knights riding at each other, and whoever the Lord favors wins the joust. And the Lord favors the most virtuous. So the winner is not the strongest, but the one who walks nearest with the Lord. That's the understanding here. And that's what he will do, and it's an expression of his pride. So that's the portrait of Sir Gawain and the knight at the outset. And Gawain is introduced there, and I'll leave that over. I'll skip over that. And come to the end of the 7th segment here. Because now we meet the Green Knight for the first time. Hardly had the music but a moment ended, and the first course in the court, as the custom been served, when there passed through the portals a perilous horseman, the mightiest on Middle Earth in measure of height, from his gorge to his girdle, so great and so square, and his loins and his limbs so long and so huge, that half a troll upon earth I trow that he was, but the largest man alive at least, I declare him, and yet the seemliest for his size that could sit on a horse. For though in back and in his breast his body was grim, both his paunch and his waist were properly slight, and all his features followed his fashion so gay in mode, for at the hue men gaped aghast, in his face and form that showed as a fey man fell he passed, and green all over glow. So he looked like a fairy. He did not look like a man. There's something supernatural about him. And he looked like Superman. So he's got shoulders like this, and his waist goes down like that. And he's not just big and heavy. He's a human perfection, and yet doesn't seem, there's something unreal about him. And well, he's green. He's green from head to toe. Well, that's probably a good sign. There's something unusual about him. And not just he is green, so is the horse he's riding on. It's a green knight riding a green horse into the middle of the court. So in the midst of this, when Arthur wants a miracle to happen, well, now he gets one. A green knight rides into the court. And what does he say? And he has, what does he have in terms of his decorum? He looks terrifying, first of all. His size, his greenness, but, section 10, and yet he doesn't have a helmet on, and he doesn't have a hauberk, which is a protective thing for his chest. He doesn't have a pisan, he doesn't have a plate that was proper, so he doesn't have plate mail on, so he's not dressed up for battle. He doesn't have a shield. He doesn't have a shaft for shock or for blow. But in his one hand, he held a holly bundle. So here's what he's got. He's not dressed out for war. He's got a holly bundle, a bunch of holly. You know what a holly is? right? The evergreen stuff that you deck the halls with, boughs of holly, fa la la la. He's got holly in one hand. And in the other, he has an enormous axe, ugly and monstrous, a ruthless weapon, a right for one in rhyme to describe. The head was as large and as long as an ell-wand, a branch of green steel and of beaten gold. The bit, burnished bright and broad at the edge, a well-shaped for shearing, as sharp razors. The stem was a stout staff by which sternly he gripped it. So he has two things. He's got the holly bob on the one hand, and he has an enormous axe. So he's not dressed out for war, but he's got an axe. And it's a big axe. And it's a green axe with gold. Quite extraordinary. What do we make of this? Well, you might say, well, what's with the holly, first of all? Like what? Okay, the axe, I see that, but what I mean, it's just, I brought you flowers. No, it's not that. What does it symbolize? Well, I'm not sure, but in Norse mythology, the figure of, everybody does Norse mythology these days because they watch Thor in movies and stuff like that. So these are not, a few years ago when I mentioned these, everyone's eyes glazed over and they didn't know what I was talking about. But have anyone watched the Thor movies? Because it's Thor, and there's a figure who's his half-brother named Loki. Loki is his half-brother, and he's a sort of a treacherous trickster figure. And at one point he slays the king's son with a holly branch. He just tosses it, and it hits him and kills him. It's not, I don't know if it's told in the Thor movies because I haven't watched them. Sorry, I just know that they're out there. But that's part of Norse mythology, is that Loki is this disruptive character, and holly is not necessarily a sign of peace. It might be, but I think here it may be not. There's something ominous about even that. But certainly the axe is ominous. There's no doubt about it. And it will describe what we're about to see, which is a beheading game. Common in the Middle Ages, by the way. Yes?
Yeah.
Good old game.
I didn't understand, like, as I was reading. So he shows up and he's like, hey, you want to try and cut my head off? And then he cuts his head off. And then he goes looking for the one who he beheaded.
No. So,
Sorry.
No. So it's a beheading game. Let's come to the beheading game. We'll note the details here, and then we'll comment. It's a very strange game, for sure. But again, beheading games are not uncommon in this day. They're part of this sort of romance genre. There's something, these are stories of characters who did exist, but it's hard to believe that the episodes existed because they're miraculous. But it's a beheading game. And he goes, and the first thing he does is he rides up to the dais, so the platform in which the king and the queen are seated, and it says, to none gave he greeting, so there's no courtesy. So he rides right up, he gives greeting to none, gazed above them, and the first word that he winged, now where is he said, the governor of this gathering? Well, he's up on the dais. What are you talking about? Who's the governor? Here's the king here. Well, he's the guy that's up on the platform. It's obvious to everybody in the room. He's insulting him, in other words. Where is he? I don't see anyone that looks like a king here. For gladly I would on the same set my sight, and with himself now talk in town. On the courtiers he cast his eye and rolled it up and down. He stopped and stared to espy who there had most renown. When they looked for a long while, so if you think about this, he rides in, this green giant on a green horse with a giant axe and a holly bob. He rides right in, right up to the dais on which the platform in which the king and queen are, and says, where's the king? So the proud man is being insulted in front of the whole court, and the whole court is sitting there silently, not knowing what to say. Like, what on earth is happening here? And they looked for a while on that lord gazing, for every man marveled what it could mean. Indeed, that horseman and horse such a hue should come by as to grow green as the grass, and greener it seemed, than green enamel on gold glowing far brighter. All stared that stood there, and stole up nearer, watching him and wondering what in the world he would do. For many marvels they had seen. but to match this, nothing. Wherefore a phantom and fey magic folk there thought it. This must be the realm of fairy. It's the people it's the fairy people that have come in here. And so to answer, little eager was any of these knights, and astounded at his stern voice, stone still they sat there, in a swooning silence, through that solemn chamber, as if all had dropped into a dream, so died their voices away. Not only, I deem, for dread, but of some 'twas their courtly way. Now he's mocking the court, by the way. So the poet is saying, well, it's not just that it was dread, they were being very polite. No, they weren't. They're terrified. They didn't know what to say. It wasn't their courtesy. The poet is having fun. To allow their lord and head to the guest his word to say. Then Arthur before the high dais beheld this wonder, and freely with fair words, for fearless was he ever, saluted him, saying, Lord, to this lodging thou art welcome. Courteous. The head of this household, Arthur, my name is. Alight, as thou lovest me, and linger, I pray thee. And what may thy wish be, in a while we shall learn. So he ignores the discourtesy, and he treats him politely, demonstrating his greater courtesy. And what may thy wish be, in a while we shall learn. Nay, so help me, quoth the horseman, he that on high is throned. To pass any time in this place was no part of my errand. But since thy praises, prince, so proud are uplifted, and thy castle and courtiers are accounted the best, the stoutest in steel gear that on steeds may ride, most eager and honorable of the earth's people, valiant to vie within other virtuous sports, and here is knighthood renowned, and is noised in my ears, that it has fetched me hither by my faith at this time. You may believe by this branch that I'm bearing here that I pass as one in peace, no peril seeking. For I had set forth to fight in fashion of war, I had a hauberk at home, and a helm also, and a shield and a sharp spear shining brightly. So he hasn't come in for that, but he's come to ask a game, a contest. Now, what is about to take place here is, and it's a key aspect of the court, is this word. It's central to the whole of the story. Troth. I think I mentioned it when we talked about Beowulf, but just in case, and to reiterate it, even if I did, the word troth in English is not much used these days. It's used only in the context of plighting one's troth, which is pledging one's allegiance in marriage. To plight your troth is to offer yourself in a sort of a covenantal relationship. It's essential to the medieval world. You swear to defend your king. Your king swears to reward you for it. That's plighting your troth. It's also used in the context of marriage. It's a covenant relationship between a husband and a wife, and also before God. You're not just like if you ever stand before somebody in marriage, you're not just saying, I'll take you, but you're doing it before God. And there's a covenantal relationship there because God relates to his own people as a covenant-giving God. And they're responding in like fashion. That's plighting your troth. Now, connected with troth is the word truth. But truth is not just empirically verifiable, accurate statements. It's saying the truth in conjunction with this idea of covenant faithfulness. And so Gawain is going to be tested, and we'll come to Gawain in a second, but I might have to pick it up next time, but we'll see if I can finish it here. He's going to be tested in accordance to his allegiance to truth. Will he be truthful in his speech? Because if he isn't, he will not be the courteous knight that he is purported to be. He won't be the courtly lover. So it's all about being truthful. Now compare Gawain to Odysseus. Odysseus lies all the time. It's counted wise. Gawain never lies because his understanding of God is that God never lies. He's the way, the truth, and the light. He's truthful. Gawain also must be truthful. He is pledged as part of his bond to other people to be truthful at all times. That's at the center of this contest, is the pride of Arthur and the faithfulness of Gawain. And Gawain will say that he's the least of the knights. That's not true. He's the best of the knights, because they have humility here. But Gawain, the contest is offered by the Green Knight that, well, here it is. Let me use his words here. I have no wish for warfare, section 13, but on my word I tell thee, hereabout on these benches are but beardless children. These are full-grown men. So again, he's insulting everybody. Were I hasped in armor on a high charger, there is no man here to match me. Their might is so feeble. And so I crave in this court only a Christmas pastime, since it is Yule and New Year, and you are young here and merry. If any so hardy in this house here holds what he is, if so bold be his blood, or his brain be so wild, that he stoutly dare strike one stroke for another, then I will give him as my gift this guisarme costly, this axe. 'Tis heavy enough to handle as he pleases, and I will abide the first brunt. Here bear, as I sit, if any fellow be so fierce as my faith to test, hither let him haste to me and lay hold of his weapon. I hand it over forever, he can have it as his own, and I will stand a stroke from him, stock still on this floor, provided thou wilt lay down this law. So here's the word. That I may deliver him another, claim I, and yet a respite I'll allow till a year and a day go by. Come quick and let's see how, if any here dare reply. So here's the contest, and he's laying down the terms. Anyone here, you get to strike the first blow. Here's my axe, you get it. And then in a year and a day's time, I will get to do it in return. That's the deal. Do you give your word? It's quite the contest. You get to strike the first blow. Chop off my head. And then in a year and a day's time, I get to do the same. You have to agree to that. You have to swear. You're giving your word. What is your word? Your word is your bond. It's part of your character. Truthfulness now is all important. It's the opposite of the Odyssey. There's no deceit that's allowed. You have to be faithful. For Gawain to be the courteous knight, the chivalric knight, the courtly lover, he has to be faithful in every sense. Perfect, in fact, in all senses. But particularly, he has to keep his word. But that's the contest. It's the beheading contest. To make the beheading contest brief, Gawain chops off the knight's head. The knight reaches down, picks up the head, and then the head talks. Says, I'll see you in a year and a day. Rides out. And everybody, uh-oh. That's it. We'll leave it off to the next time, but we will come to fits 2, 3, and 4, those sections, and we'll see what happens in the interim. And I'll be able to move forward more quickly then, and we will finish it. But that's the contest, and note how different Odysseus is from this knight. One, deceit is the way of heroism. The other is truthfulness is the way of heroism. And a different society is envisaged in the process. Okay? See you next time.